Caleb Merritt stood at the corral fence with both hands flat on the top rail and watched the dust come down off the north ridge. Beside him, Eli pressed his face between the slats and did not blink. The boy had been standing there since mid-morning, and it was now past 2, and no one had told him to wait. He had simply chosen the fence and stayed. The dust had shape. Not wind-thrown and not a single rider crossing open country, but the wide, low drift of animals moving together at a pace someone had chosen for them. 20 head. Maybe more. Pushed from behind by a figure too small for the horse under her, and sitting the saddle like she had been born in it. Ruth Parrish brought the cattle through the gap in the cedar brake at a walk. She did not hurry. She did not look toward the house to see who was watching. She held the line between the creek bank and the tree cover with the patience of a woman who understood that rushing cattle the last quarter mile undid the work of 3 days. And she let the led cow find the corral gate on its own. The gate was standing open because Eli had swung it wide 14 minutes ago, without being asked, at the first sign of dust on the ridge. Caleb had given up on those cattle 11 days before, had walked the north breaks for 3 days straight, and come home each night with nothing but sore feet and the knowledge that he was looking at ground he could not read. Had stood in this exact spot and done the arithmetic, 23 head, gone through a fence gap he should have caught in October, scattered into the breaks along the Elkhorn where the draws twisted back on themselves, and a man who did not know how to read ground sign could ride in circles for a week without closing the distance. He had told no one. He had entered the loss in his own head and let the number sit and hoped, in the way that men hope when they know hoping is not a strategy, that the cattle might drift home on their own. They had not drifted home. Ruth had brought them home. She guided the last stragglers through the gate. She pulled up, leaned forward in the saddle, and counted them through, her lips moving with each animal. When the last one cleared the rails, she swung down and looped the reins over the post. 23. She brushed the trail dust off her sleeves with 2 sharp strokes, one calf born on the way back, so 24. Eli climbed the fence and dropped into the corral and stood among the milling cattle as if he had been expecting them. She had arrived 6 weeks before, in the second week of March, on a mail coach that stopped at the crossroads 3 miles south of the Merritt place. She carried 1 carpet bag and a letter she had written herself in answer to a notice Caleb had posted at the land office in Norfolk, housekeeper wanted. Widower, with 1 boy. Room A&D board A&D, $4 a month. The notice had been posted for 9 weeks. 2 women had come out to look at the place. The first stayed for dinner, looked at the state of the chimney, counted the mouse droppings along the baseboards, and left before the plates were cleared. The second rode the full 3 miles from the crossroads, stood in the yard for 4 minutes, made it as far as the barn door, and turned around without stepping inside. The house explained itself. 2 rooms, dirt floored in the back. Plank floored in the front where it mattered less because the planks had warped and separated enough to let the wind through at ankle height. The stove worked, but the chimney drew poorly, filling the front room with a thin haze that never fully cleared. The roof leaked in 2 places that Caleb had marked with tin pans positioned under the drips, and 1 place he had not yet found, which announced itself on rainy mornings as a dark stain spreading across the ceiling boards above Eli's cot. Eli was 8. He had not had a bath in a period of time that Ruth assessed upon first meeting him as substantial. His shirt was on backwards, 1 boot was laced and 1 was not. He watched her from behind the woodpile with the fixed, unwavering attention of a barn cat deciding whether something was prey or threat. I can cook, clean, keep accounts, mend, and manage a kitchen garden. Ruth set her carpet bag on the porch. I cannot make lace, play piano, or tolerate being lied to about what the work actually requires." Caleb looked at the carpet bag, then at the mud on her boots, which was the red clay mud of the crossroads 3 miles south, and then at the way she stood. She stood the way a woman stands when she has carried her own weight for a distance and is not going to mention the distance. The work is what you see. "Then I will start with the stove. That flue has not been swept since last winter, and that is why your chimney smokes." She was right about the chimney. A cap of creosote as thick as her thumb had narrowed the flue to half its draw. She scraped it clean with a hoe handle wrapped in burlap and had the stove pulling properly by the time the light went. She was right about the stove, which needed its firebox scraped and its ash door reseated with a strip of tin she cut from an old can. She was right about the leak she found above Eli's cot, which was a split shingle she patched with tar paper and 2 nails before Caleb knew she had climbed to the roof. What Caleb did not tell her, and what he had not told anyone, and what he had spent 2 years arranging the facts to avoid telling himself, was why the cattle numbers did not match what they should have been. Eli's attachment began on the 4th day, with an egg. Ruth had stripped the bedding from his cot that morning, boiled the ticking cover and the blanket in the yard kettle, and hung them on the line where the March wind could beat them clean. While they dried, she turned the mattress and restuffed it with fresh straw from the barn, packing it tight at the edges and loose in the center, the way her own mother had done it. When she put the cot back together, she folded the blanket at the bottom in a way that made a pocket for his feet. That evening, Eli walked into the kitchen where she was scrubbing the shelf boards. He set a brown egg on the table. He did not speak. The egg was still warm. He had been carrying it inside his shirt, held there with one hand against his ribs, and a faint smear of straw clung to the shell. The next morning, he brought 2. By the end of the first week, he had claimed the chair nearest hers at the table and moved it 3 inches closer. A distance small enough that neither adult acknowledged it and large enough that the legs scored marks in the packed dirt floor. He began appearing wherever she was working. If she was in the kitchen, he sat on the floor near the stove. If she was in the garden, he knelt 2 rows over and pulled whatever she pulled. He did not talk much. He watched her hands and copied what they did, and when she corrected him, he corrected himself without complaint, because the correction came from someone he had decided to believe. Caleb watched all of this from whatever doorway or fence rail put him in range of seeing without being seen looking. He registered the eggs, the chair, the copied work. He noted that Eli's shirt was now on the right way and that both boots were laced. He said nothing about any of it. He ate what Ruth cooked, thanked her once at the end of each meal in the same 2 words, and went back to the work he understood, which was fencing, plowing, and the 100 small carpentries that held a homestead together. The work he did not understand stood on the North Ridge and drifted a little farther from home every week. The Merritt place had not always run cattle. Caleb was a farmer by training and by instinct, a man who thought in straight furrows and right angles and fence posts set to line. His wife, Nora, had grown up on her father's ranch south of the Elkhorn, where the country opened up into mixed grass and the draws ran with enough water to hold a herd year-round. When Nora's father died, the cattle came with the marriage, and for 3 years the old man's hired rider, a Texan named Spence, had managed the herd. Spence knew every draw and waterhole and wind shift in 30 miles of open range. He read the ground the way Caleb read a plumb line. He brought the cattle home when they scattered, moved them to fresh grass when they needed it, and kept the count accurate to the last calf. Spence left after Nora died. He had worked for her family, not for Caleb, and when she was gone, the tie that held him was gone with her. He shook Caleb's hand at the crossroads, wished him well with the boy, and rode south toward the Platte. The gap he left was not something Caleb could close by working harder. A man could teach himself to shoe a horse, hang a door, set a bone in a calf's leg, repair a wagon axle in the field. Those were skills made of steps, and steps could be followed. But reading ground was not a sequence of steps. It was a kind of seeing, built up over years of watching how grass lay after cattle moved through it, how mud dried in a hoofprint depending on the hour and the wind, how a herd chose its line through broken country. Caleb had watched Spence do it and could not repeat it any more than he could repeat birdsong after hearing a bird. He hired day riders when the wheat money came in. When the wheat money did not come in, he did not hire anyone, and the cattle drifted, and the count dropped, and the difference between what the brand registry said he owned and what he could actually lay hands on grew wider every season. Ruth found the gap on a Tuesday. She had been keeping the household accounts in a ledger she bought in town with her own wages. She counted everything with the instinct of a woman who had learned early that knowing the number was the first defense against being cheated by it. Flour by the sack, lard by the tin, eggs by the week, hay by the stack, measured against the number of animals it was supposed to be feeding. When she sat down with the figures and compared what the place should have been producing against what it was, the gap was immediate and unambiguous. She did not ask him directly. She walked the north fence line on a morning when Caleb was in town filing a lumber order, and she found the break. 3 rails pulled loose by a cow leaning against them through the autumn, and the ground beyond torn up with tracks that were weeks old and half filled with blown dirt and snowmelt. She came back. She heated the water for the washing. She said nothing through supper. The next morning she was up before light. Caleb heard the barn door scrape open on its runners and looked out to see her saddling the bay mare, the one good horse on the place. She had a bedroll tied behind the cantle and a sack of biscuits and dried beef slung over the pommel. "I am going to check the north brakes." She pulled the cinch tight with the quick double wrap of someone who had saddled horses since girlhood, 2 fingers hooked under the latigo to test the tension. "I may be gone 2 days. Possibly 3. You will not find them." She looked at him, not with challenge and not with pity. With the level attention of a woman who had already made the decision and was allowing him to speak as a courtesy before she left. "I grew up working cattle in the sandhills. My father ran 200 head on open range, and I could track a steer through standing water by the time I was 12. She checked the headstall, running her thumb under the browband to make sure it lay flat. "Your cattle are in the draws below the cedar ridge. The grass is late, but it is coming in there because the south face holds the warmth, and the water in the side draws runs later than the creek. They will not have moved farther because there is no reason to go farther." She mounted, turned the mare north, and rode out at a trot that settled into a walk as she crossed the first rise and dropped below the skyline. Eli stood on the porch in his bare feet and watched her go until there was nothing left to watch, and then watched the empty ridge for a while longer. She was gone for 3 days. On the first day, Caleb worked the fencing on the south line and told himself it did not matter whether she found the cattle. The operation could survive without them. He would plant the north section in spring wheat and make up the difference in grain, and the fact that he had never been able to do what Spence did would stop being a fact he had to carry. On the second day, he repaired the broken rails on the north gap with new posts and a cross brace, which was the work he should have done in October, and which he had not done because repairing the gap meant looking at the gap, and looking at the gap meant naming what had gone through it and why. On the third day, he stood at the corral fence and waited. Eli waited with him. The boy brought 2 cups of the coffee Ruth had taught him to make, too strong and slightly scorched, brewed in the tin pot she had scoured clean the first week. He set 1 cup on the fence post for his father and held the other in both hands. She will bring them back. Caleb looked down at his son. She knows how. Eli drank his coffee with the gravity of a boy performing an adult task and finding it within his capability. He stated it simply, as fact, the way he stated the egg count or the weather. And then, the dust appeared on the North Ridge. The pressure arrived on the fourth day after Ruth brought the cattle home in the form of Harold Denning. Denning rode in from his place east of the Elkhorn crossing at mid-morning on a gray horse that was better fed and better shod than any horse on the Merritt place. He was a decent man, well established, with a wife and 4 grown sons who ran a clean operation on twice the acreage. He had come once before, 2 weeks after Nora's funeral, with a smoked ham and an offer of help that Caleb had accepted for the ham and declined for the help. This time he came with a number. He sat at the kitchen table, set his hat on his knee, and laid the offer out in his careful, unhurried way. $3 a head for the full herd. Below the market price at Omaha, but paid in cash money, today counted out on this table. Enough to clear the note Caleb owed at the Farmers' Bank in Norfolk, with $14 left over. Denning had spoken with the bank. He knew the number, and he named it without embarrassment, because in his view a man's debt was a practical fact and not a moral one. I am not trying to take advantage. He turned the hat slowly in his hands. I have watched you work this place for 4 years, and you are the best fence builder and plowman in the county. But cattle on open range require someone who can read the country, and you have lost stock 2 winters running. Sell the herd. Plant the north section. Do the work you were built for. Caleb sat across the table and felt the silence settle into the room like dust settling after a wagon passes. Everything Denning said was accurate. Every word of it. The cattle were a piece of the operation he had inherited and never mastered, and the 2 years since Nora's death had made the fact harder to hide with every passing season. He had concealed it from the neighbors by repairing fence instead of riding range. He had concealed it from the men at the land office by filing his brand renewal on time and letting them assume the count was good. He had concealed it from himself by doing the arithmetic in a way that set the missing head aside as weather loss, which was a category large enough to hold almost any failure if a man did not look at it too closely. Ruth stood at the stove with her back to both men. She poured the coffee into 3 cups and set them down, and did not sit, and did not offer an opinion, because no one had asked for one, and the opinion was not hers to offer uninvited. I will think on it. Denning nodded, finished his coffee, put his hat on, and rode out. That night, Caleb sat alone at the table after Eli was in bed and Ruth had gone to her room in the back. The offer lay in front of him, written in Denning's square, careful hand. $3 a head. Cash, he could clear the note, plant the north section, and stop carrying the weight of a skill he did not have and could not learn. He picked up the pen and held it over the paper and set it down again without signing. Eli saw the paper the next morning. He could read well enough now to manage it. Ruth had been working with him every evening after supper, using the Bible, the seed catalog, and the printed label on the flour sack. He stood at the table before breakfast and read the offer slowly, his finger tracking under each word, his lips shaping the numbers and the terms. He did not ask about it. He went outside and fed the chickens and brought in the water and sat through breakfast without speaking, which was unusual enough that Ruth noticed, and Caleb pretended not to. 3 days passed. Denning was expected back on Saturday to collect the signed paper. On Thursday evening, Ruth sat down with Eli for his reading lesson as usual. Eli took his school slate from his satchel and held it against his chest with both arms crossed over it. "What have you got there?" He turned the slate around. 3 names, written in white chalk in the block letters Ruth had taught him. The first line read Caleb Merritt. The second read Eli Merritt. The third read Ruth Parrish, positioned directly below the other two, with no gap between them, in the same hand, at the same size. Underneath all three names he had drawn a single straight line connecting them. Ruth looked at the slate for a long time. "I wrote it because that is who lives here." Eli set the slate on the table, face up, and placed both of his hands flat on it, as if it were a deed or a contract or a piece of evidence being entered into a record. "You found the cattle and brought them back, and Pa could not do it. I know he could not do it. I am not supposed to know, but I do." Ruth sat very still. "If he sells the cattle, you will go away, because there will not be enough work to keep you, and he will not be able to pay the $4. He pressed his palms harder against the slate. "That is the arithmetic. I did it." He looked at her with the plain, immovable certainty of a child who has worked out a sum and checked it twice and found it correct and is now waiting for the adults to catch up. Harold Denning rode in on Saturday morning at 10. He tied his gray horse at the post and came up the porch steps and knocked once. Caleb opened the door. Behind him at the table, Eli sat with the school slate positioned in front of him, the three names facing up, his hands flat on the surface. Denning looked past Caleb to the boy and then to Ruth, who stood near the window with a dishcloth over one shoulder and her hands at her sides. "I am not selling the herd." Denning studied him for a moment. "Mrs. Parrish manages the range work. She can track, she reads ground, she drives stock, and she brought home every head I had lost, plus a calf born on the trail." Caleb did not raise his voice. He spoke as a man states a fact that has been confirmed and does not require argument. "The cattle stay." "And the note at the bank? I will work it off in fence contracts through the summer. I have spoken to 3 outfits east of the river already. They have agreed to the rates." Denning considered this. He looked at Ruth again, and at Eli, who had not moved from the table and sat with both hands on the slate as if it were a document that required witnessing before it could take effect. "All right." He put his hat on. "I meant no harm by the offer. None was taken. And I am grateful for the asking." Denning left. The sound of his horse on the packed yard was the only thing in the air for a while, and then Eli picked up the slate and carried it into his room and set it on the shelf above his cot, face out, where it stayed. On Monday, Caleb rode to Norfolk alone. He came back in the late afternoon with a folded paper from the county recorder's office. He had taken Ruth's name and added it to the brand registration for the Merritt stock. The document read Caleb Merritt A&D Ruth Parrish, joint, and it was stamped and dated and entered into the county record where anyone who cared to look could find it. He came into the kitchen and laid the paper on the table next to the lantern. He had ridden 30 miles round trip and had not stopped to eat. Ruth was kneading bread. Her hands were white to the wrists with flour, and the kitchen smelled of yeast and wood smoke, and the coffee she had left warming on the back of the stove where the heat was low enough to hold it without burning. "You are on the brand." She looked at the paper. She did not reach for it. "That means the cattle are ours, legally and on the record. If I am gone or unable, you have the authority to sell, move, or keep every head. The county knows it. Denning will know it by tomorrow." He stood with his hands at his sides. "And it means I am asking you to stay, not for the housekeeping." She turned back to the bread. She worked the dough for a long time, folding it over and pressing it flat and folding it again. And the lamplight made their 2 shadows on the wall behind them, stretched tall and overlapping in a way that looked, from the doorway where Eli was sitting with his slate balanced on his knees, like one shape. "I will stay." She said it quietly, into the work of her hands. Caleb heard it. Eli heard it from the doorway. He looked down at the 3 names he had written, ran his thumb across the chalk line that connected them, and carried the slate back to the shelf above his cot. It did not need to be held anymore. The argument it had made was settled. By June, the north section was fenced clean, and the cattle grazed in a rotation Ruth had mapped on the back of an old seed catalog page. 3 pastures moved on a 2-week cycle, with the creek access kept open along the east boundary where the calves could water without being crowded by the older stock. Caleb built the fences. Ruth moved the herd. The work divided itself along the line of what each of them was good at, and neither of them had to pretend to be good at the other's share. Eli opened and closed the gates and reported every evening at supper how many head he had counted, a number he delivered with the grave precision of a boy who had decided that counting was the most important work on the place and intended to do it perfectly every time. On Sunday mornings before church, Ruth saddled the bay mare and rode the fence line. Eli rode behind her on the wide brown pony, sitting it with solemn concentration. They came back with a count and a list of repairs written in Eli's hand on the slate, which Ruth read aloud while Caleb ate his breakfast and planned the week's work around what needed fixing. The chair nearest hers at the table had been in the same position so long that its legs had worn smooth grooves into the dirt floor. The coffee was too strong and slightly scorched, made in the tin pot she had scoured clean the first week, and nobody who lived in that house would have had it any other way.